Hello, welcome to PostColonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today's webinar is about globalization and how the knowledge of that globalization, especially its theory, can inform our study of postcolonial studies. So, first of all, I do want to apologize that I scheduled it on July 4th, not realizing that today is one of the biggest holidays in United States. So my apologies for that. So first question that comes to my mind is, my apologies for that, is like, how did I come to study globalization? I mean, I am a professor of literature, post-colonial studies, and it's kind of odd when I tell people that part of my specialization is globalization, and within that, neoliberalism. So the way it happened was that, in the United States, in order to get our PhD, we all have to, take comprehensive exams. And when I was developing my comprehensive exam lists, I had to take 3 exams. So I had the 2 exams down, like primary text in postcolonial studies, the secondary text in postcolonial studies. But then we had to have a secondary area, right? And that's when I talked to my advisor, and we decided that I was going to develop a list of books about neoliberalism and globalization. And I think that decision was highly consequential in a good sense, because it informed my way of studying post-colonial literature, my way of teaching, and in a way it has given me a different perspective in teaching post-colonial literatures. And those are the experiences that I want to share. So in today's talk, my main mission is to, first of all, explain what do I understand or mean by neoliberalism or neoliberal globalization. And then we will go on to talk about how to apply it in teaching and writing about post-colonial texts. And so that's kind of the mission. So, and if you, in the meanwhile, as I'm talking, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them my way, and I will try to incorporate them in today's discussion. But thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here and to exchange these ideas with you. Okay, so here is my understanding of the reason we qualify globalization with the word neoliberal before it is because most of us who work in this field want to be specific that we are not necessarily anti-globalization and that we are not necessarily talking about cultural globalization. At the core of globalization is the economics, and that cannot be denied. But what we critique and challenge in our writings, in our teaching, is the neoliberal aspects of globalization. Now, neoliberalism is invoked by everyone. There are conferences on it. But sadly, no one really necessarily explains what do they mean by it. So if you look at the term itself, neoliberalism, it tells us that it is some new form of liberalism. Which liberalism? Economic liberalism. What are the basic, tenets of economic liberalism? Of course, its genealogy goes to Adam Smith, to Wealth of Nations, right? And Adam Smith's idea at that time when he was writing the book that free trade is better than holding colonies, right? So the main impediment to economic activity is regulation. And his idea was that the freer the people are, to seek their self-interest, the better the economy will be. Now, in that about 800-page books, he's trying to theorize how would the state work, right? And he's trying to theorize it against Locke and Hobbes, right? And the main question in that was, how will we regulate a society of owners, right? Where people own property, right? And of course, the mechanistic view of the nation state and state is that the state would run it, right? The organistic view is that people would come together and learn how to do it, right? So his idea was that instead of the state regulating economic activity, if we let the market do that, and he famously uses that one sentence in that huge book, the hidden hand of the market will guide the economic activity. So from that is derived this idea that if market forces are allowed to work freely, right, competition will make sure that the best practices rise, right? And then if you go to Milton Friedman and others, the reason they are called neoliberal is because they are retrieving these knowledges from Adam Smith and re-articulating it against what we called or used to call the Keynesian economics, which was the post-war economic order, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, and against Marxism, of course, right? Now, the Keynesian economics model was that the state was encouraged to intervene into the market with massive investments, especially in the times of the crisis. And the economies that developed over time during that time were protected, right? But they were national economies. Now, what neoliberalism then suggests is that the state should withdraw from the market and let the market choose the best through competition, right? And so the neoliberal economists then see the state and the government as the largest impediment to economic activity, because they also have this idea of human subjectivity, right? And that idea is that we are naturally self-maximizers. We try to reach our maximum potential. Regulation comes and stops it. If we remove the regulation, competition will enable all of us to seek our best potential. And if we create a society of self-interest seekers who are seeking their best, everything will rise up and there'll be a trickle-down effect of wealth. That is neoliberal economy, building on Adam Smith. Now, why do we criticize it, right? I will answer your question in a minute. Okay, so let me build up to this. So the reason we criticize neoliberalism is for different reasons. First of all, that we know, and I have written about it too, you can read some of my books about it. We know that in the marketplace of ideas, first of all, the competition is not even. To say that someone sitting in the United States, someone sitting in India and Pakistan, if they are seeking their self-interest, they have an even playing field is absolutely ludicrous. Against that, Milton Friedman and others would suggest that, well, every country should develop a niche, right? What is called their competitive advantage, and then build on that. But then we realize there are so many economies that are not at a stage where they can build a competitive advantage. But for our studies, so neoliberalism is this re-articulation of Adam Smith's idea and their further explanation in the economic field, but it then permeates also into social sciences and humanistic studies. And I'll answer any questions you might have about neoliberalism. So what ends up happening, right, when economies become neoliberal, is that the state withdraws, right, from the market and replaces its own functions through private enterprise. Now, if you are an economy at a certain stage of development where labor rights have already been protected, where there is an insurance system, maybe the workers would do okay. But if you are an economy in transition, when the government withdraws from the market, right, what ends up happening is that the job or the work environment that is created, it becomes increasingly precarious, right? People have no safety net. right? So if they have no safety net, it's easier to exploit them, right? Easier to pay them less. On the other hand, since the state can no longer articulate its own existence or rationalize its own existence through good works because it is already withdrawn, the state increasingly becomes a security state. And instead of saying, we'll do this for you, we'll take care of you when you're sick, the state basically starts building up armed forces, police forces, right? And makes a security promise with its people that no matter what, we will protect you against whosoever tries to attack it. These are not things that are happening in a causal way. I'm not saying neoliberalism causes that, but this is the relational aspect of the state and neoliberalism and also of the market. Now, how does it work in postcolonial studies? So we already know that in postcolonial studies, we study literatures produced by people from former colonies, mostly 19th and 20th century colonies. What we study in that is the impact of colonialism itself, the response from the natives, maybe in revolutionary terms, but in semiotic terms. And then we also try to read literatures produced by people from former colonies who live diasporic lives. These are some of the aspects of postcolonial studies. Now, if we do that only in the cultural realm and not critique the economic globalization, right, then we are missing a few things. And what we are missing is a larger structure within which our lives can be understood. So let me give you an example. For example, there is a beautiful novel by Rohinton Mistry, right? A Fine Balance, right? Came out in 1983, I think. Now, Rohinton Mistry, we know, is a Canadian author, but he's a diasporic Indian-Canadian author. The novel is set in India, right? We can simply read it as a novel of cultural malaise and individual failures because Miss Dalal, who is the main character towards the end of the novel, she has tried to be independent, and she has tried to be independent through enterprise, right, by starting her own business. And we could read the whole novel, as her failure and she going back to her family, right, in individual terms. But we could also read that novel with a knowledge of how global economy works and how does it impact people's lives. So first of all, she lives in an economy where to be free has a certain kind of economism. To be free, she can't just say, I am going to go access the state-sponsored system for women and seek some help, go to some. No, she has to start a business. That already is she thinking in market terms, right? Now, when she launches her clothing sewing system, she has to hire 2 tailors, right? And what we then learn is that the tailors who are expert tailors, they are not expected to craft something and create something. They are just supposed to constantly sew together the pieces that are sent to Miss Dalal through the middleman, right? So the labor is no longer specialized, right? It's patchwork, piecework, or what you now call the gig economy. And then her success depends on she takes the work from the tailors and then takes it to the middleman, right? Who has the absolute power to say, okay, we'll accept this work, or say, no, this is not good enough. So her situation is increasingly precarious at both ends as she deals with her workers and as she deals with the people for whom she's making these things to export. So reading it this way, then we realize when her enterprise fails, it fails not because the tailors are not working hard or that she is not trying her best. She fails because within the given system of economics in which she's trying to succeed, she has to maintain a deeply precarious balance. And if something upsets that balance, there is nothing for her to fall back on. Right? There is no state-sponsored loan system. There is no insurance. Her insurance within the novel was that the beggar master, the guy who was the gangster of that area, was supporting her. right, protecting her. When he dies, she loses that support, right? Even the support that she had was privatized, right? In all of this, then we can understand if we have a little bit of knowledge of how global economy works, how neoliberalism works. So then what we could have construed as an individual failure on the part of one character, right, becomes a structural failure of the system in which we exist, right? And if we can read that in a novel, then of course our students and us, we can go and rethink how does this global economy work, right? And that is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Um, so another example that I can give is another novel based in India, right? The White Tiger, right? Aravind Adiga's novel, which is a very popular novel. And that again that novel can be understood really, really better if we have a little bit of idea of neoliberalism and how global economy works. And I use that novel to explain, Marx's famous two terms, like the formal subsumption of labor and the real subsumption of labor. And what are those two terms? Let me first explain. So towards the end of Capital Volume 1, in an appendix, Marx talks about the real subsumption of labor versus the formal subsumption of labor. So the way neoliberal economy works, if you look at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, right, labor has been subsumed in the project of capital formally, right? They work for a corporation, they work for a company, they work for a call center, right? But that subsumption is not real because the labor is still also constrained by the pre-capitalistic mode of living. Not pre-capitalistic, but the pulls and pressures of things that are not capitalistic still determine their actions. So, for example, if you're in India, and you can all put me wise, to a certain extent, your caste still decides what you can and cannot do. If you're in Pakistan, it depends on which region you live in. If you're from the rural part of Sindh, you probably are a peasant worker for a landlord and you absolutely have no rights, right? Now, when these people are incorporated into the capital, right, they're formally incorporated because they're moved to wage labor, working in a factory, working as a driver, working as a cook at someone's house. But they have not obtained the privileges and rights of being workers within capital because they can still be controlled, right, by the forces that are outside of capital. So in case of the protagonist in The White Tiger, right, what keeps him constrained within that system, he's a driver, right, to a rich person, is because his family lives in the rural parts, right? And he knows that if he does something drastic, his family will pay the price, right? That's why he is the white tiger, because he takes the step of actually getting rid of his master, stealing his money, and starting his own business. So what does that novel teach us? That he does that knowing that they will go after his family. The only person of his family that survives is the young kid who was living with him. But to be free of the power of the capital, right? That you can't necessarily within a system like that just keep on working hard and eventually make it. You have to do something unusual. That is what he has to do, unusual. No, we can understand the novel better if we have some knowledge of globalization and how neoliberalism works. So these are some of the ideas that I want you to keep in mind when you read post-colonial texts and write about them. And the reason it's important is because if we just do cultural readings of text or individual readings of characters and just focus on the text and do not plot it within the larger economic system in which things are being produced, then our understanding would be limiting, right? Then we can't teach our students to think outside the text about the world in which they live. But also, if we don't look at the text critically, then that can end up internalizing for us the very logic of the market economic system in which we exist, right? So Sukhdev, let me see what your question is. I'm going to put it up here. Sorry, what is liberal in neoliberalism, which has pushed teeming millions into poverty? Isn't terminology intriguing and misleading? The people and intellectuals grapple to. Great, good idea. So I have already explained what liberal in neoliberal means. Liberal is not liberal as we understand it culturally. Neoliberal means that they are appropriating what was considered liberal economists in Adam Smith and others. And liberal economists, what they believed was that government should get out of the business of economics, and economics should be liberated to do things as the market dictates. So there is nothing like typically liberal in neoliberalism, right? As we understand the term culturally liberal. Now, that is a really good question. If neoliberalism was supposed to make our lives better, why is poverty increasing in the world? And that is a very interesting question that Milton Friedman and others don't try to answer. Now, the economists on the left, like Samir Amin and so many other people, I mean, if you look at it, I'm holding some of the books are on my desk. There is a wonderful work by John Rapley, and I'll put the link to the book in the description of this lecture when I edit it. What he's talking about it that in neoliberal economics, he first explains the concept of a regime. I mean, how does an economic regime come to be? There is an elite, and there are people who they are supposed to lead, but there is a consensus, right? Now, this comes from Antonio Gramsci. And for the people to follow a certain elite, there has to be a certain kind of misrecognition. They must look at the elite and see that their interest is guarded there. And when that comes to crisis, the regime needs to renegotiate the contract. Now, what neoliberal regime, the way it works, right, and it's already coming to crisis, is that for every regime to succeed, it has two different areas in which it must function. One is its distributive function, and the other is its accumulative function, right? So if you look at neoliberalism, its accumulative function is great. If you have money, and unless you're stupid, you will make more money because the regime enables you to invest more, gives you more tax breaks, right? Why does it do so? Because in neoliberal economics, we believe that people, if we let the rich keep more money and tax them less, right, they will have a surplus. If they have a surplus, they will invest more in the market. Hence, they will end up creating jobs. There is a problem with this idea, but that's the idea that drives that economics. I will give you my critique of it, but if you really want to see my critique of it, you can find it in one of my books on Talibanization, because I go over it a lot there. But now the second aspect of neoliberal regime is distributive function. And that is where it fails, right? What is the distributive function of the state? Care of the poor, care of the elderly, free school system, free education, right? Homeless shelters, right? All of these functions of the state are either privatized or eliminated, right? So what ends up happening is the rich who are supposed to invest their surplus in the market, right? They are not doing that because while we are giving them more money, the global economy has become speculative, right? What do I mean by that? Speculative in a sense that when Locke and Milton Friedman talk about the surplus capital that people have and that people would naturally invest it close by, they were thinking of national economies. In a global economy, immensely rich people, first of all, they don't feel any social responsibility, and two, they don't need to invest their money locally, right? They can with a click of a button, they can send $1 billion elsewhere and loan it to one bank, the other bank, and money then is gathering the higher exchange rate or higher interest rate, right? So according to Zygmunt Bauman, it's a slightly dated book, for every $10 spent in the global market, only $2.50 produce real value. Rest is money making money by itself, right? So when that is happening, of course, the wealth is not trickling down. The poverty keeps rising because the government pulled back from its function of taking care of the poor, right? And the private sector has not replaced that. Actually, the private sector depends on a kind of labor that has less rights, that is precarious, and that can be exploited. Look at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, right? All these nations have spent a lot of resources, the private sector, in busting the unions, in trying to make sure that the workers are completely bound in place so that their labor can be extracted. So, I mean, how do intellectuals grapple with it? Of course, there is a vast range of scholars, especially coming from India, quite a few in Pakistan, but in United States, in South America especially, there's a whole movement against neoliberalism, right? Which every year they have a gathering called World Social Forum. Now, why did it rise early, this resistance movement in South America? Because, and this comes from Noam Chomsky's work on South America, in 1970s, South America was the first, Latin America was the first space where neoliberal policies were mandated. I mean, think of it, this is called the Washington Consensus, right? These Washington economists are the ones who came up with this idea. The government then helped implement these policies in South America. I mean, the prophet of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, was an economic advisor to Argentina. Argentina did everything that he told them to do, and then their economy collapsed. So which economies in one way or the other came out of this experience slightly better? The economies that were protectionist, okay? Protectionist in a sense that economies that did not let outside imports come in until the mid-80s, right? And they took their time in developing their own infrastructure, developing their own industry. So some of the examples of that, you can see China, India, right? These were the economies that were protected economies. Now, I'm not saying that they've solved their people's problems. They are still neoliberal economies. But at least when the outside influences came, they had their own industrial base to compete with them. The economies that didn't do that, that remained open, countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the other countries in Africa, they got overwhelmed by the infusion of capital and its influence in their in the global economies. So these are like some of my ideas. The point is that we can take these ideas, right, and we can use them in our study of post-colonial literature. And what does that enable us to do? What it enables us to do is to see, because those texts are being produced within this system, right? So not to be a reflectionist, but by and large, at least some of that has impinged upon the imagination of the author, right? And we, the readers, then need to read it critically enough to see, okay, which point of view is this novel privileging? Right? If a novel tells you the story of one young man, right, who through his own struggle made it from a rural part of India and Pakistan and became a millionaire, right? Which mythology is it privileging? Right? Is it a mythology of a religion, or is it a mythology that in the current global economy, everyone, if they work hard enough, can rise to the top? And we know that is not true, right? But this knowledge can enable us to read texts with a slightly more subtlety, right? Okay, so let me go to another question. Has the era of globalization ended, or it has transformed into something other economic hit idea? Is there any true globalization? That's a really good question. I mean, I don't think so it has ended. I mean, there are national economies, right? But by and large, if you look at any major developing economy, they can't even afford to be protectionist because they have signed deals and treaties with World Trade Organization, right? And the only countries that can like attempt to break this globalization imperative are like countries like United States, which have the resources to be reactionary in that sense. I don't think so. It has ended, right? Are there responses developing to it, right? Is there any true globalization without exploitation? That's a really good question. My personal idea is that the way the globalization is being proffered, right, it still serves the interest of the developed countries and the North Atlantic countries. And this comes across in a lot of works, like Saskia Sassen has a beautiful work, A Sociology of Globalization, in which she would tell you that 64% of the profits still come back to North Atlantic regions of these global corporations. But precarity, being precarious workers and laborers, is, I would say, is not an outcome of neoliberal globalization. It's necessary precondition. In order to be profitable, global corporations need cheap labor, right? How do you make cheap labor cheap? After all, I mean, no one would say, I am cheap labor, hire me. You make labor cheap by fixing them in place, by reducing their rights, and their rights to building solidarities, their power to negotiate their own price, right? How do you do that? If you are a large enough corporation, you can go to Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and negotiate. We will bring a factory here. It will create 4,000 jobs, but we will not allow labor unions, and we will not give health care, right? Now, since those economies are dependent on this investment, right, they will write off the rights of their own people. If you are China, it's even worse, right? How is it worse? I mean, you're a one-party system. People have no rights, right? You can literally make your workers available to the global corporations as the cheapest and the most silenced workforce in the world, right? Because they're coming seeking cheap labor. So how is that labor cheap? That labor is cheap because it cannot move. A Chinese worker cannot say, I have these skills, I'm going to get on a plane, go to United States of America and get a better job because I have the skills. The same neoliberal system, globalization, people who are pushing it, they want the capital to move freely. They want the commodities to move freely. But the third aspect of any productive system is labor. Since the 1970s, while the movement of capital and commodities have been made easier, the movement of labor has been made harder, right? So what does that allow these global master economies to do? To create these pools of workers who can be exploited and whose exploitation underwrites the progress of the world, right? And that they need that exploited labor, absolutely need that. Think of it this way. This is not something new. There is a thing called Taylorism, right? In United States, it's operative everywhere in the world. And what is Taylorism? Mr. Taylor was an industrial, psychologist or whatever you want to call it. He devised methods that businesses practiced, which enabled the businesses to extract more labor from their workers, because the profit is in that. How much labor can you extract from your workers and how cheaply can you hire them, right? So absolutely, I would say that no, I think exploitation is growing in the world. And part of it is because even economies as powerful as India, right, and China are dependent on the global market. And how do they make themselves attractive? We have a skilled workforce, right? Cool. Come to Chennai, right? Come to Ahmedabad. We have young people who can speak English in American accent. We'll give them names, Bob, Joe, and Frank, right? There'll be a couple of Samanthas there, and they will answer phone calls. People from America, Canada, elsewhere, their refrigerator is not working, right? These people will have no protections. They will not ask you for health care. You don't have to pay them as much as you will pay an American worker, even though they have the same skills, right? That's how we are attracting jobs in the developing world, right? By saying our people have the same skills, communicational and technical, but if you bring these jobs here, you don't have to pay us that much. So how is that going to raise the relative standard of living of people? And I'm still talking about the tech workers. I mean, if you go down the road with people who may not have those kind of skills. So absolutely, I don't think so. And there are figures on it that, yeah, people's life might have been better a little bit, but not too drastically. The system continues because the powers that be still invest in it and want it. But I don't think so. It's improving people's lives the way it promises to, right? Okay, here. Is printing of the US dollars robbing the poor nations of value, which are forced to do? I Not printing of the US dollar, but I mean, US currency is considered a hard currency, right? It is the currency of global exchange. And so all the soft currencies measure their value against it, right? I won't say that the printing of US currency does that, but the ability of United States, right, to control the global economic policy. Now, think of it. How is global economic policy governed and implemented, right? Post Second World War, three institutions were developed, right? So these are called the Bretton Woods institutions because all the victorious powers in after the Second World War met in this small town in Vermont called Bretton Woods, and that's where the World Bank, the IMF, and what is now called World Trade Organization were developed as three institutions. The function of the World Bank at that time was to stabilize the European economies, right? The IMF was there to give short-term loans to economies to get through the crisis. And World Trade Organization was supposed to negotiate a world trade deal, right, where all parties. Now, first of all, these institutions are very Eurocentric, and the way you get to vote in them is non-democratic because the value, the weightage of your vote is connected to your GDP. So if you are a consortium of third world countries who want to change global economic policy, you absolutely do not have the votes to change anything. So the institutions are undemocratic. Two, how does, let's say, IMF work? Why does it have so much power? Think of the immensity of their power. They can go to the populist prime minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, right? And tell him, you need to raise your taxes. You need to raise the prices of petrol. You need to decrease your defense funding. An outside organization has the power to go to a sovereign nation and dictate their terms and get them accepted. With all the might of Pakistan army, they can do that to India as well. With all the tanks and gunship helicopters and whatever India and Pakistan have, one mid-level person from IMF can go and meet Mr. Imran Khan and Mr. Modi and tell them to change their budget. Why? Because we owe them money, right? How did we end up owing them money? In 1973, when the Arab League, when the OPEC launched the oil embargo against the United States during the 1973 Arab-Israel war, immediately there was a crisis, and it was a crisis of cash. All these newly developed nations, independent nations, were suddenly cash-strapped. Now, since it's a function of IMF to give short-term loans, right, they all went to IMF and borrowed money to run their current economies. Now, those monies came with certain stipulations and a very high interest rate. Try searching what is your country's IMF debt online. You won't find anything on it. How much interest is Pakistan paying? Maybe in the budget there is a line, but the rate of interest is not known. So that's when these developing nations got trapped into this IMF debt trap, right? Now, what is IMF? IMF gets its money from its member nations. Its sole function now is to safeguard the interests of its shareholders, which are these powerful nations. But it has the power to break your economy. If they withhold the loan that they've promised to you, not only would it in direct sense deny you the capital that you need as a nation, but since that would be big news, your market will clash, right? So they have that kind of coercive power. All they're trying to do is safeguard their own loan, and their argument is our loan is a short-term loan, so you're spending money on long-term projects, which doesn't suit us. What are long-term projects within a national economy? Education, healthcare, building of roads and infrastructure, right? Rural development, right? So if you have IMF money, all you need to do is do things short term, right? And then make sure that the return is there so that you can pay your debt. So what are you doing? You're paying interest on the debt every year. Right now, majority of developing economies are not even paying the principal. They're just scrambling to pay the interest on this debt. Now, this is the global system of economics in which you, me, and others are supposed to succeed. Now, tell me how. Now, of course, the economists on the left, the activists on the left are basically saying it's very easy to solve this problem. Forgive the developing nations' debt. Let's then have an equal playing ground. Imagine if Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Tunisia, all the North African countries did not have to set aside money every year to pay the interest on their IMF debts, right? And there's a beautiful book by David Stiglitz, right? Making Globalization Work. He is a critic of IMF, right? And he would tell you how IMF has become an imperial institution. So, okay, so Sukhdev Saib, excellent analysis. Okay, good. So the idea is, okay, how do these ideas help me teach literature, right? I mean, now this is our understanding of what is literature education. Now, one other thing, that is part of our colonial legacy is that our colonizers left us an educational system, right? What is that educational system? That we already have pre-designated subjects, right? We have things that we are supposed to teach, things that we are supposed to cover, right? And then we encourage rote memory, or here is a shortcut. I don't know about India and Bangladesh. In Pakistan, you can actually buy a thing called test paper for each subject. So all you do is memorize the answers and reproduce them, right? So because of that system of education, by and large, we are not necessarily producing people in humanities who think critically and who think critically about the system. Now, if you look at the business schools and other schools, they are already teaching those students how to succeed within the marketplace as it is already existent. No one is teaching them how to redo the market, right? How to re-articulate how the global economy should work. So the only people who do that is we, the humanists. It's our job then to train our students, not just that come to my class and I'll teach you 5 Shakespeare plays and your life will be better. No, our job is to encourage our students to think critically, right? We do that through reading of texts. When we teach them these texts about India, about Kenya, if I'm teaching Ngugi Thiong'o's Devil on the Cross, I cannot teach it without teaching them also the critique of capital, right? So then that's where this knowledge becomes necessary in our pedagogy, because we can encourage our students to think through a story critically about the world in which we exist. Why is it so unjust, right? And maybe that can help us then collectively change the world, right? Okay, so I had this question coming up from the feedback link, please. So I don't know what you mean, like feedback in terms of comments, because you can just post the comment in a YouTube comment box and it will come to me. But if you want like a feedback link afterwards, it will be, of course, this video will be posted on YouTube, after I edit it, right? Okay, let me see if there are any other questions. So like I'm going to give you just kind of my concluding thoughts on the subject, and then I'll see if you have any questions, and then we can talk about it, right? So overall, as I just mentioned, when we think of postcolonial studies, traditionally we have thought of thinking in terms of colonizer-colonized relationships, resistance movements, women's rights, right, minority rights. All of those are, of course, subjects worthy of our study. Then we can also see in the response tradition, how was resistances mounted, how still we need to resist the imperatives of the global order. All of that is part of postcolonial studies, right? What knowledge of neoliberalism and globalization allows us to do is, and of course, there are Marxist readings of colonialism as well. What this knowledge allows us to do is it allows us to read within literary texts as to how certain characters are produced, what kind of thought processes are being developed or maybe over-determined by the neoliberal system in which we exist. And then maybe as part of postcolonial studies, offering the critiques of neoliberalism, but also looking for alternatives, right? What kind of a world system within which would be better, in which global economies, national economies become life-giving forces. And there is a whole body of work, of course, on this topic from postcolonial studies, but also from other fields of social sciences. The only question is, if we learn a little bit about how globalization works, what is neoliberalism, what is precarious work conditions, how are they enabled, right, and operative in our lives, then as scholars and teachers, we can probably create teaching materials and write articles that address these issues, right? And that, in a nutshell, is what I think we can gain from some knowledge of neoliberalism and some knowledge of globalization within the field of postcolonial studies. Okay, now I'm coming to questions. Sorry, there's a little bit of delay between one. Okay, so Oves of Ifzal, does globalization affect the production of literature and the interests of the audience of the, think of it, why not? Yes, it does. So that is assuming that we, and as I said, not being reflectionist in that truly Marxist sense, that I don't believe that everything that we do is a reflection of the world in which we live. But wherever we live, by and large, some of our actions are overdetermined by the system which we believe in or in which we function. So if you are reading a literary text, it's produced by someone. That person can either write against the grain, like Ngugi Thiago, and say, I'm going to create characters who are opposed to this world order, right? That's a different kind of writing. But by and large, what you read in a work is what Pierre McCary calls the silences of the work, right? What are the silences of the work? Things that a novel takes for granted. So if you're reading a novel in which someone is doing job interviews and going door to door with his or her degrees, is there a critique of it? Or is the novel taking it for granted that young people must do that to succeed, right? So when you have a certain degree of knowledge of neoliberalism, you can see what aspects of the life as produced discursively under neoliberalism is the author taking as truth and representing them, वो बॉलीवुड की फिल्में आपने you might have seen, like in which there is this powerful young businessman who falls in love with a young woman, and that is already internalizing this idea that young rich men can save your life, right? But if you're reading a novel that complicates that, right, then you already know that this author is not just taking the world as it is as an incubator for producing our subjectivities, but is using that text to critique that, right? So our job as scholars then is to come to the novel with that knowledge, right? And read its silences, because by not stating certain things within a text, you end up privileging the status quo, right? And so that's also something that we can question with this knowledge, right? Okay, I'm going back to your. Do you think post-colonialism is complementing and supplementing social? Absolutely. I mean, post-colonialism cannot exist without the knowledge of social sciences. I mean, look at people we use, right? Even I have a series of lectures on Edward Said, and that's where what he's trying to say, so much of what we do, we draw from anthropology, we draw from sociology. This entire lecture, this conversation will not be possible if I had not studied some economics, at least the macroeconomics, right? So I think post-colonialism as a field of study might be established in literature departments, but it absolutely cannot just be aesthetics. It absolutely cannot just be about poetry and novels. Any worthwhile post-colonial scholar will have to learn what is coming out, the research coming out of social sciences, economics, right, anthropology, any other fields of political science. I mean, how do you critique global politics without knowing geostrategy, without knowing global politics? So as a field, I think it is supplemented by social sciences. And if social scientists read our work, I think it can make their work better. So, so the relation is a two-sided relationship. Okay, so I am so delighted that you all have joined me. This is going to be a regular feature. Uh, if everything goes well, every Saturday I will choose a topic and have a conversation with you all. Now, you can help me promote these conversations, because if we do that, I can benefit more from them personally because of your questions. And of course, more people can benefit from it. And also, like, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and feel free to suggest any topics for future webinars. And if it is within my limited expertise, I'll be happy to take it on. And if any one of you has a certain degree of expertise in any other topic, I can arrange it where you can also come and join the conversation, and we can have a conversation. I can accommodate with the program that I'm using at least 10 people on the screen. So if you are interested in that, just drop a comment in the comment section after I upload this video, after editing it. But that's all I have. We've been going for about 50 minutes now. So if you have any other questions, please post them and I'll answer them. If not, let me just conclude by saying that I started with a brief explanation of what I understand by neoliberal globalization. I do have videos, and I'll post them up there already, that explain the concept. And then I went into what is its significance for post-colonial studies, how can we post-colonialists incorporate it in our discussion. And now, by way of answering your question, we already know that it can be, post-colonial studies can be enriched by social sciences, and maybe it can also be an enriching influence on the study of social sciences. So that's all I have today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will soon announce the topic for next week. But if you have any suggestions, please send them my way. And I am deeply grateful that you all take the time to join me. And I will be back next week, next Saturday, with another topic of conversation. Until then, thank you. Stay blessed, stay safe, and as always, peace and love.